Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, longtime archaeologist, co-director of the center at La Sierra, and also a terrific tour lecturer. How many lectures, how many tours are you doing per year now? Two or three. Yeah. So you're keeping very active in that. And we are privileged together to welcome Dr. Sten LaBianca, who is a professor of anthropology and associate director of the Institute of Archaeology at Andrews University, and maybe more importantly to us, a long time good friend, colleague, and, for the sake of our program, an anthropologist. Because we want to talk about anthropology. People sometimes get those confused with archaeology, so we want to talk about that. And then we want to talk about the contributions of anthropology to study of the Bible. Sten, okay, that's how we work here, okay? I'm Doug, you're Sten. Larry, okay. Right. So we're all using our first names as you work here.
Which is typical on a dig. We always use first names.
Right. Sten, what got you interested in anthropology? I want to ask you that, and then I want to ask you about, to continue talking about what kinds of archaeology or anthropology there are, and sort of discipline.
Sure. Well, I got started in anthropology when I went to Middle East College in Beirut, Lebanon. And that was a transforming experience. And one of the highlights of that year was that I went to Jerusalem. And there I met for the first time really, Larry Garrity, who was, I think, then doing a fellowship for his doctoral work there. And he took me and a friend on a walk around Jerusalem. And it just all came alive. And the very important thing about his role model is that he actually told me that there is a career where you can do something like this. It's not often you get to meet people that are doing something that special. And so that really helped focus me. And so I decided that I want to study in the Middle East. How I got interested in anthropology is that I had a very good teacher then at Andrews. I went back, I said, I want to study anthropology. And so I took a class from Gottfried Oosterwald, who was a very dynamic cultural anthropologist.
Very dynamic.
He had been living in Papua New Guinea, and he brought tremendous, exciting stories. And then Robert Little, a physical anthropologist, someone who specialized in the study of human bones. And he had brought back from the first season of excavations in Jordan at Tal Heshbon.
1968.
68, biblical Heshbon. Boxes of bones that really nobody had really been able to study. So as an undergraduate at Andrews, he gave us students a chance to help him clean the bones. And then we thought we had a lot of human bones. It turns out that they weren't human bones, they were animal bones. And at that time, back in 1971, or actually this was 69, animal bones were just not saved on archaeological project because they were in such abundance, but people didn't really think there was anything to learn from them, so they threw them out. But nevertheless, it's remarkable that they had been saved. It was perhaps because they weren't sure if they were animal bones or not, but there they were. And so he invited us as undergraduates to partner with him in finding out what kind of bones these were. And it didn't take long. We started spreading them out on the tables. And there was a repetition in the patterning here. And so right before me, I have now a bag from one of our excavations that I just emptied. And I can now look at this very quickly and tell you that this is almost all sheep or goat. And I have to say one or the other because we cannot, with this kind of a collection, they are too fragmentary to be able to say for sure, except perhaps for this one, which is, I think, quite certainly a sheep. But, and that's because of the particular shape of this condyle. But other than that, it's a sheep and goat assemblage. But there's some interesting things. This is a very young animal because it doesn't have the ends on it, so you can fully see that it has yet not fused. So this is less than 1 year old. And so from these animal bones, we can actually reconstruct the kind of farming that people did. So for example, if they were emphasizing cereal production on the plain, they would have a pair of oxen, and then they would, of course, the oxen would pull the plow, and we could expect to see some bones of oxen. If they had primarily sheep and goat, of course, then we will see sheep and goat bones in our collection. If they are producing olives and grapes on the slopes, they will not use oxen. They will use mules and donkeys because they are more agile. So you can see already from these animal bones, we can tell what the orientation is. If they're growing primarily olives and grapes, then you know that they're not just household food. This is for export. Whereas if it's primarily cereal, wheat and barley and sheep and goat, that's probably more domestic use with just a little bit of export. So we can really learn a lot about the economic orientation of people from studying the bones.
So you're taking these bones and then reconstructing lifeways.
The farming and the daily life.
How people survived,
right.
How they fed their families.
Exactly.
That is biblical context.
Absolutely.
That is part of the biblical story.
Now, some of our viewers will wonder why there's little bits and pieces.
Yes.
Is that how you usually find them, or
yes.
are there larger ones?
That is how
How does it get that way?
Yeah, excellent question. This is indeed how we find them, and you could actually say that this is really table remains. So these are bones that are the result of meals, and of course in preparing a typical meal to be hospitable, you don't just sort of slaughter the animal and serve a whole long bone. You break it up, cut it up. And the pattern actually of butchering and cutting up is one way that you show hospitality. The more it's cut up, the more you are pleasing the guest. So we find things quite broken up. And then when, of course, the bones, the meat has been eaten off of the bones, people throw them out the back of the tent or through the window because there are dogs out there and they will soon come after it. So the fact is that we don't actually, if we have 2% of the table remains from animals, that's probably as much as we do. The reason we are getting some of these is because the dogs don't get everything. And of course the dogs will be less able to eat the larger bones quickly. And then there's many of the bones will wash into cisterns and so forth. Remember we had that cistern that was just full of bones and made me very happy. So, so the point is though that we do get a sample, and that sample is enough to give us a very good clue of the daily life and the orientation of the economy, whether it's for self-preservation and personal family use, or whether it's for a export in the marketplace.
Right. So let's then think about other kinds of anthropology.
Yeah.
You're talking about physical anthropology.
Right.
What other fields are there? And we'll be looking at some slides that get into part of those. But what are the subdisciplines?
Right. Well, there are 4 main subdisciplines in anthropology. The first is actually biological anthropology, and biological anthropologists are interested in the origins and persistence and change in human skeletons. And so, of course, a biological anthropologist can look at this femur, and he can tell you a lot about the age of the individual from the fusions, the state of the fusion at proximal and at the distal end. From a skull, they can tell these are very young individuals because you can clearly see these fusion lines. And from the teeth, too, you can tell whether from the eruption pattern, the age of the child. So, again, the physical anthropologists use human material as one of the windows on the study of human change over time. Then you have cultural anthropologists, and they are they don't study and work in archaeological sites. Instead, they go out and they live with local populations and try to understand the underlying logic of being a Hutterite, or the logic of being a Yanomamo. Typically, these cultural anthropologists traveled to exotic places back in the day. Today, they study people all over the place, but their ultimate goal is to understand how people have a sense of belonging and how they are part of a particular culture. And then we have archaeology, which of course we'll be talking about here, which is a study of human cultures in the past using the remains of past cultures. So I actually see archaeology as a branch of cultural anthropology. It's just that we are using the remains of the past to reconstruct cultural ways. And finally, there's linguistic anthropology, and they are interested in the origin and persistence and change in human languages.
What about ethnography?
And of course, the method of cultural anthropologists is ethnography, which is where you go and you do what we call participant observation. And actually, I did a lot of that from my fieldwork. Once I got interested in these animal bones, and there wasn't a lot that was known about them, I thought it'd be very interesting to go and actually see and learn about the place of these animals in the present day. And I was lucky because by the time we were digging in 68, in 71, people weren't using pottery so much. It was more plastics and paper and so forth, tin, but they were still plenty of animals.
Animal bones.
Yeah.
So the connection was immediate to the present. So I did what was called ethnoarchaeology, where I actually observed how they would select animals for slaughter, how they were slaughtered, how the animals were then prepared for dishes, what happened to the bones afterwards. So I followed that whole process, and that taught me a great deal about why it is that the bones look the way they do.
Right. Let's take some time to think about some slides.
Yeah.
And we'll move through them fairly quickly. But we have some slides about your work and about anthropology in the Bible. And ultimately, we want to ask the question, how does anthropology help us as we read Scripture? That's such an important part of who we are, and we want to do that. Who might this be on the right, Stan?
Well, this is yours truly in probably 1971.
It looks a bit rebellious.
We have to say that you hail from Norway originally, right?
That is
so
true,
people
right.
need to know that you're a Nordic
That's not hard to
anthropologist.
miss, is it? And that's my mentor, Robert Little, who was a physical anthropologist and who opened up for me the opportunity to actually become involved in the study of animal bones.
And then we have a few pictures of some of those bones. These from Heshbon or Hespan.
They come in large quantity.
They come in large quantity from the burials.
Yes.
Mostly Roman time burials, so New Testament.
Byzantine and Roman.
This one, Larry?
This
I
was
think-
Islamic burial, you know. We ran into a more recent cemetery. People thought that they were perhaps Turkish.
Well, this one, the face is not, oh, maybe it was originally facing...
I think it might have been,
Yes,
right,
right, okay. This is from Tel El-Ameri, another one of our project sites, and this is a burial cave.
I think it's important to note that we have a meter stick laying there
To give us
a sense
scale.
of scale.
Right.
And that, of course, also is included when we make a drawing. And a good excavation will provide a meticulous drawing showing every one of those bones in situ, plus photography that helps us to document what this is like, because eventually, of course, we take it all out.
Right.
So this is a very important process, the recording of what we find.
Now, I don't remember exactly the ages represented in this particular burial.
But they're quite young, I can tell from the meter stick.
Often, at least half of these burials from antiquity are children.
Right.
They're pre-adult.
You can see that femur, humerus there.
We're talking about here?
No, further down.
Here.
That one, yeah. I mean, it's barely 20 centimeters. I mean, you're talking
And we
about
might
a young
say
animal.
that the arrow always points to the north.
That's right.
Right.
So there are a lot of youngsters in this collection, and even a little infant.
And that's fairly standard.
Yes, it is.
Now that led you, Sten, to think about a much larger picture. You are, in many ways, our big picture person.
Oh.
As we think about this larger Madaba Plains project, one of those food systems. Tell us about this.
Well, when the decision was made by the leadership of the Heshbon expedition, Dr. Siegfried Horn and Dr. Garrity, that they would break new ground by studying animal bones, that created some dissonance in the camp, because a lot of people felt, you know, we are spending this money to bring people, and why should we be doing work on this material that really can't tell us anything? That put me into a position of being defensive, in a sense. And sometimes that can be a creative opportunity. Having to think, so why should we study the bones? And then I began reading other anthropologists, and of course in North America they were doing a lot with animal bones. And they also had developed this idea of cultural ecology, which is the idea that humans' cultures interact with the environment and with the animals. And it began to dawn on me that, of course, this is not just a way to find out about very particular things like butchering practices and diets. This is part of how people provide for their food security. And that story also relates to pottery. It relates to the architecture. It relates to everything. So the food system is really all of the interrelated activities that people carry out in their quest for food. And it includes how water is provided, how we raise crops, protect them, how we harvest them, how we process, and all of those things. And you know, we are so out of touch. You in the audience, you're sitting there in your comfortable homes. We are here on this stage. We've not been out, probably any of us, doing all the hard work of preparing the fields, of being out there daily watching and protecting the fields, like we have in those towers.
Right.
And then harvesting with old ancient methods, hard back-breaking work, then grinding the flour, and eventually preparing the meal. I mean, the fact is that for 99% of the population in the past, the quest for food was the predominant activity. And it's no wonder Jesus Christ parables are mostly about
food.
the daily life.
Well, and what you did then was asked us to look at everything that we found and see if there was a food connection to it.
Exactly. In fact, I even made the argument that before we introduce the idea of cult and religion, we need to first see where it might fit in the food system.
Right.
And then, yes, if we can show that something is, for example, if we find that we have a whole large number of foot bones that are only the right side, that's odd. Then you're getting into something religious, and so forth.
It was thanks to your contacts that we got some specialists from Europe who studied and published our bones. And as a result, we think we have one of the largest such collections ever published. Is that right?
We actually broke ground in that ours is the first project to publish a whole volume just on the animal materials. In most reports, they appear just as a chapter at the end, whereas we have a whole volume on the study of the animal bones, actually multiple volumes that tie into it, but yes.
This is a great summary. It means that we don't have to read all of the small print here. Thank you, Sten. This one, of course, this image is very visible. Where did food systems lead you in terms of this long-term picture here?
Well, one of the perhaps unanticipated consequences of the excavation that Larry and I, well, the three of us, where we all were at Hespan, was that it actually spanned 3 millennia. It was not just biblical. It was classical from the Roman and Byzantine times, and it had Islamic layers. And so the original question that we came with was primarily focused on the biblical, but we needed to reinvent ourselves in a sense so that we could actually understand the whole long term. And so the one question that you can ask that applies to all periods, including today, is how did people provide for their food and shelter for their daily life? And that actually became then a new frame under which to investigate the biblical period, the Roman, and so forth. And this chart shows boom and bust over time. It's not a linear development of from primitive to modern, but instead you have periods where people were primarily pastoral nomads in the late Bronze Age, and then they become settled in villages and towns. They grow cereals, and then it goes back to a nomadic way, and then in Iron II it becomes even more settled. We have fortified villages and town, but then it collapses again. And then in the Roman period it booms again and then collapses. So this is a really important long-term view, and what has fascinated me and animated my research is to try to understand why these cycles occur. And that has actually also focused my attention on what's going on in these low intensity periods. Because the fact is, what we dig out of these sites, a lot of it comes from the tips of these boom cycles. We see the most active settlement periods. We don't know, we know less about these low intensity periods. And that's important to keep in mind when we come back to understanding some of the biblical stories.
Well, one can come along here and put some lines. I mean, if we want to think about the New Testament, we put it right here in the Roman period. This tells us something about the level of settlement, the nature of survival tactics and strategies. If we wanted to go to the time of David, we'd come over here, about here to 1,000. So we're on a down. If we wanted to talk about, well, of course, modern. I mean, the highest point here is the Christian expansion in the Byzantine period.
Following Constantine's
So we make these connections very easily, and it just adds to the picture. Then we have a 1996, I'm not sure if this is what the present is here, but you've been working, I think you're in the third phase. We'll come back to that on another program for HESPAN. But what we want to think about here is how what you've been talking about here leads to some deeper understandings. That's where we want to go.
So, as I stated earlier, I have wanted to understand why we get the changes that we get over the long term. And for example, in the Iron Age, people were speaking Ammonite and Moabite and Hebrew. When we come to the Roman period, of course, they were speaking Greek and Latin. And then we get later on, we get into the Islamic and you have Arabic. So there are things going on that have a lot to do with other things than just simply how people survive. And so that brings in a need for a bigger picture. And the fact is that we are located at the crossroads of 3 continents. Egypt to the south, and Asia to the east, and Europe to the north. And so this has been a very active area where various empires have championed particular civilizations. So Alexander the Great came through here, and he wanted to make everybody live like the Greeks in cities, the polis. And so we have actually at HESPAN even some of the evidences of the beginnings of a well, it's actually a settlement of Greek soldiers at HESPAN. And then with that whole classical expression, you get the whole idea of the Acropolis, with stairs going up and a temple, exactly what we have in HESPAN. So I had to broaden the perspective beyond just the quest for food to studying civilizations. And I have actually proposed a definition of civilization that comes out of archaeology and of our work. I'll read it here. A civilization is a luminous constellation of radiant attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, values, elite cultural traditions, institutions and works of art, artisanry or how craftsmen work, and architecture that emanate from a particular or from several geographical epicenters. And that's a mouthful, but the point is that an archaeological site like HESPAN reflects and refracts multiple civilizations, starting with the ancient Egyptian, then the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, Abbasids, Umayyads, Mamluks. And so we have actually reflections of all of these, but beneath all of that, people are living and surviving. So the story now is really looking at local survival under these empires.
And it makes the biblical story so much more interesting when you set that narrative in the midst of all these other things that you've been talking about.
Is the context in which the whole Bible was conceived. A context of a people struggling to have an identity underneath a succession of predatory empires.
So let's look at some of these empires. You've talked about some of them, Sten. Romans, we get to the New Testament.
For example, there we have the fine Roman city of Jerash in northern Jordan. And you can see the steps leading up to the Acropolis.
It looks like Gadara or Qais.
That's maybe...
Correct. And then what you have here is
the steps going up to the Acropolis at Hesperia. And then whereas the Romans had a temple at the summit, then come the early Christians, the Byzantines, and they take those stones from the temple and they construct their template, a Christian church, a basilica church. And here's a reconstruction of that. And then following them come the Umayyads, which is the Islamic civilization. They actually take the stones from the earlier period and reuse them to now insert what we call a hammam or a bath, which had hot and cold water, so that the governor who lived here could regale his guests with a fine bath. And then the Mamluks, they
What,
are
13th century?
Yeah, 13th to 15th century. They were an Egyptian colony that came and took possession of the land, and especially they were interested in the sugar industry in this area. So we find a lot of sugar pots, and this particular sherd has Arabic Mamluk writing on it. And then finally the Turkish settlement in Hespan. So you see these different civilizational templates in the material.
And these are the larger empires.
These are the larger empires, right.
So then you came up with this great and little traditions.
So this is very interesting because whereas the great traditions refer to the culture of the elite in state-organized societies, and they usually curate their culture by written texts and so forth, but the village people don't really know all the details of that. The great tradition then are those people that are bringing those different empires. The little tradition refers to how local people make a living. Their knowledge is not transmitted by writing, but rather by word of mouth from one generation to the other. And so we can, this is a great example, this picture of a great tradition. I mean, there's no little village that'll build those kinds of aqueducts. This is a great imperial monumental project. By contrast, the little traditions
in fact, we can look at the sources for them.
Exactly. They are the basis for this daily life. And so let's show you some of the little traditions that we've learned about.
Go through these quickly.
There are 7 that we have focused in on. In contrast to the great aqueducts, we have these, people know where to find water. Amazing. They know where to find water in the desert. They know how to keep water in a cistern and so forth.
Okay.
Then you don't have monoculture. You have a mixed agropastoralism, so you can shift back and forth between being a farmer and being a shepherd, depending on opportunities and threats. And here you have Hespan. And that's why people didn't just live in houses like we do in Europe and North America today. They lived in tents. They would follow their sheep, but they might even put in a tent out near the field where they're cultivating. And they used caves. Caves were the motels of the time of David. And you know David knew his caves and his altars.
Oh yes, a lot about the story.
Then also, we often can't imagine people not having fixed borders, but back then people didn't have fixed borders. That's why the Abraham and Lot's shepherds were fighting. And then hospitality. People are not just being good manners.
Such an important
It is a way to find out what's going on, what opportunities there are, and so forth. And then honor and shame. That's the police system without a police. And finally, the tribe. What makes people have a sense of belonging. And with a tribe, you get a wife, you get land, you get all the things you need.
And some others, but I wanted to end with this slide in terms of biblical connections. Just a word or two, just have a few seconds left, Stan. What do we have here?
So, this is from Isaiah chapter 5, the story of the vineyard. And we have, through our survey, found a number of these towers which were used for protection of the fields, and there are terraces nearby and cisterns.
So we'll make a lot of those connections.
All of those connections are possible.
Thank you, Larry and Sten, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope we provided food for your soul and something for you to think about, and look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep exploring, and keep believing.